All right, good morning. How you guys doing? Fabulous. Good. Okay, so do you guys feel okay about the exam?
Yeah.
Felt like it was okay. Other class I accidentally made a tricky question, much more tricky than I meant to. So can be glad it wasn't you guys. Okay, so that kind of wraps up sort of the drinking water side of things. Most of what we've been learning applies kind of to both. Like disinfection, we do disinfect wastewater. So really how we've structured the class, and actually I should go ahead and bring up the syllabus here, is essentially we cover first sort of the physical aspects of water and wastewater treatment in the context of drinking water treatment for the most part, although certainly not exclusive, like I said. Then we went and covered the chemical aspects. So that's kind of where we are. We touched on the physical mass balance sort of stuff that applies to everything. Went into the chemical side. Those are the categories that are what we use for drinking water treatment. And then for wastewater treatment, we also use biological processes. So we get the physical, the chemical, and the biological. We don't typically use biological for drinking water, just not normally needed. If it was that bad of a water source, then probably just going to either not use it and find a different solution, or perhaps we're going to be going crazy with the reverse osmosis to just get out all of the biological or all the substrate that a biological organism could consume. So we'd basically be treating it. We can treat that stuff sufficiently, and we would have to with pretty advanced technologies. So for wastewater, we don't really need wastewater to be super ultra high quality necessarily. And as we'll see today, most of what we care about in terms of what standards we use for our wastewater has to do with the receiving water. And if you think about discharging water into the Mississippi or into a bayou around here, you might think to yourself, okay, yeah, that doesn't have to be ultra pure water that we're discharging in there to kind of match what's already there. We just don't want to overload it with maybe, let's say, more oxygen demanding substances than it's already dealing with. And maybe it's already somewhat oxygen starved just by the nature of the sediments and the stuff that's in there, a lot of biological activity. So, we don't have to take such a strict treatment protocol. So, in fact, a lot of times what's really convenient is to simply use microbiology. So we feed the organisms, or really the waste itself is the food, and we give them a chance to take in as much oxygen as they can and want. That's the activated sludge stuff we'll talk about. And they do a lot of that removal in terms of they're digesting things, making them simpler, making them less hazardous potentially, and then collecting a lot of that mass into bacterial cells, which are then easier to remove physically, just sedimentation, to take those out, and then we can landfill the cells, and that's a lot easier of a separation technique than applying the force required to get, let's say, an advanced membrane filtration system. Okay, so this is kind of the plan. Today I'm going to talk to you about just sort of an overview for wastewater, talk about the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System that governs surface water discharges. There's also a groundwater discharge regulation set. This is under the EPA. I have a little bit of experience there for when I was working for the Michigan's Department of Environmental Quality briefly after I finished grad school. And so I can kind of tie in a little bit of that. That's my plan today. Okay, so we talked a good bit about the fecal-oral route of transmission when we were covering drinking water and why we care about drinking water treatment. Should be pretty obvious, right? We don't want to eat poop in any way. Well, that's all that we talked about before was kind of on the side of when we're going to take a drink of water, this would be our drinking water treatment, right? We want that barrier right here. Well, we also have the other end where wastewater comes in, and we'll just say some sort of discharge or environment, to the environment. We want the wastewater treatment here, right? So it's still going to help. And in fact, if we take a look at the typhoid fever incidents, things like that, it wasn't simply that we started chlorination and instantly it fixed everything. There's also a lot of just generic sanitation gains that we get for having nice plumbing, sanitation, all of that. And even today, there are situations in some places that don't have adequate infrastructure where there's some concern of not insufficient, let's say, discharge, especially if there's shallow groundwater wells and also, septic systems that may or may not be operating properly nearby. So contamination of things like that. A few little examples of wastewater issues I've seen in Nicaragua, and about 10 years ago when I had a chance to visit. Top left here, we have an illicit gold mining operation. So they have essentially this little vat here with kind of a slurry of sediment and mercury to extract out gold. And then they have sort of a bit of a sedimentation system. So then they just let this flow down to here, a little catchment basin. I think they're going to ultimately collect most of the gold amalgamations in the system here. But then it just goes there, sits there for a minute, and then leaches out into the environment. Just straight out. So it's perhaps in a way impressive that you even have like this little bit of a thing. But yeah, that's obvious wastewater issues right there. And if there's no one there to tell them, oh, you need to do it this way, or you may not, we're gonna put you in prison if you keep operating or whatever. There's no permitting process there for them, presumably. So also, in the middle of a landfill, some wastewater discharge leaching straight through the landfill, people making use of that as a way to get recyclables out of the dump there. This water looks, radioactive green, right? It's because it's coming straight from a wastewater lagoon for wastewater treatment. So that lagoon is then growing a whole bunch of algae. So it's not quite as nasty as, well, it is pretty nasty. It's literally going through a landfill. So it is very nasty. But the green is just algae. So at least that's a little bit comforting, right? So some serious issues, and that goes straight into a local river right there. So some very, very obvious issues when we put it that way. And we'll take a look at cases of rivers on fire. I think we already talked a little bit about it, but we'll go through an article kind of highlighting that and the changes that came about with the implementation of the EPA and this pollution discharge elimination system stuff. Okay, so we've covered generally basically everything kind of like that. Well, I guess maybe not storm sewers, right? But we've covered just about everything except for our wastewater. And I just bring this image up again to remind ourselves that, this might be one city, right? They take from some river, they use it, send it out to their people, and then there's various sources where that water that was being used now is collected back and heads back into the natural system, right? So in thinking about it in that manner, obviously we spent a while talking about, okay, how do we protect ourselves from whatever contamination that might be there? Now we also want to consider how to potentially protect the next person downstream who might be taking it out, and whatever other considerations we might have for this body of water. For example, I was walking over here kind of behind PFT this morning. I saw somebody by the dumpsters back there, where the Chick-fil-A stuff, they're hosing down the ground there where the dumpsters inevitably leach a lot of junk from whatever's in them. It's fact of dumpster, right? I'm happy we have a good system for solid waste disposal, but one of the side effects there is you get leachate of just garbage juice, right? And that's just getting into the onto the concrete. It kind of smells bad, and so then just like hosing it up the area, trying to keep it a little cleaner. The person doing that probably didn't realize that the drains that it was going into are just a little creek that's running through. So if you were to like then take a look, now there's a little body of water, right? It's a natural creek that we've basically kind of cemented over and like tunneled through campus, I think. And it's probably going to be okay, but it is literally polluting our environment right there just by our activity. So as we think about it, maybe we should say, okay, LSU, you should have a stormwater discharge permit for this site, right? This little spot. Chances are good they have some sort of stormwater permits all around, but when we stop and think about it, and I heard some of you guys talking about it in one of your classes, I don't know which, about like the storm drains and things like that. We have a lot of places where our activities end up impacting the environment. So as we think about wastewater, we can even think about stormwater, even roadside waste, things like that. If it has some impact on the environment, that can be very important. When I was in college, I had an internship in Seattle for dealing with salmon habitats. And one of the things they were trying to figure out is how exactly roadways were impacting the salmon's ability to reproduce in the streams. And it turns out that at the time, and I didn't follow this, I'm not sure if this was confirmed, but they were starting to worry that dust generated by road brakes, so cars braking, would collect on the roadways. So you get a lot of just road dust stuff, and that getting into the waters may have been toxic to the embryos, the salmon eggs, essentially. And normally an activity like that's very widespread and not a direct dose, we probably wouldn't notice it too much, right? There's probably lots of places where salmon could grow and stuff, but the salmon fisheries is so important that the amount of salmon that are able to live and grow and then head out to the ocean and then come back is actually extremely important for all sorts of things, right? So even if there's still salmon there and they're still happy, that's if that is the issue, and if they could then control it, that would be a major deal. So anyway, what class was that, by the way, that you guys were talking about? 3200. Okay. And is that like you're trying to identify where all the inputs into the streams and stuff? Okay.
Yeah, we have to find where all the inputs are and make sure there's enough to drain the neighborhood.
Cool. Okay. So a lot about the drainage then. Yeah. So fitting timing here, because one of the things that has happened in the past is people have, at first thought of like the issue that I just described, right? This junk stuff that's going straight into our waterway. They thought, well, why not just send that to the wastewater treatment plant, right? It's kind of nasty. Well, there's a problem with that. If we combine the storm and sanitary sewers there, then if we have a lot of storm, then we overflow the wastewater, which is arguably a worse problem than a little bit of extra contamination going into the stream that no one even knows is there. I mean, I know it's there, and I like that you can, if you walk by, you can see little fish that are in there and stuff and all that. But like at the end of the day, keeping sewage out of our environment is probably more important than that particular trade-off. Okay, so anyway, big picture there. So what we're going to do in the treatment itself, if we take a look at a kind of a typical treatment design, of course these can be a bit varied, is first of all, we'll have some collection system. Maybe there is some exposure to storm sewers, occasionally that might happen, or some other inputs that are prone to getting large particles, more than would fit into a toilet or something. So there's often some sort of a bar, screen, rack type of situation. Grit removal, that's pretty common. We do that in surface water treatment for drinking as well. for obvious reasons. But that'll be there. It will be a mess, but it'll collect stuff. That plus the first sedimentation will be what we call primary treatment. So for wastewater, we have primary, secondary, tertiary. And primary is essentially the very base physical stuff we can do, right? It should remove heavy particles, large objects, that kind of stuff. And in doing so, that will actually collect some of the oxygen-demanding substances. So if nothing else, this will be good, and I think it would be anywhere from 20 to, I don't think it's up to 50. It'd probably be like 20 to, and I'm kind of just guessing here because it's been a while since I've looked at the numbers. Maybe I have it in my slides later. Percent BOD removal. So BOD, I'll remind you, is biological oxygen demand. That's one of the kind of fundamental things we look at, because we're discharging wastewater and then all the organisms in the water that receives it, if they don't have oxygen, they're going to die. So that's one of the most obvious metrics for our wastewater treatment is, okay, how much stuff that bacterial or biological activity will consume oxygen in order to eat, how much of that stuff have we removed? Because if we send all that into the environment, then the biological activity in the environment will consume a whole bunch of oxygen, and then we'll have oxygen deprivation for the fish and wildlife, and that'll be a problem. So one of the very fundamental things is BOD removal. We're going to move on later after kind of the wastewater treatment. After we flesh that out, we'll go on to take a look at modeling oxygen demand downstream. But you guys have already heard about the concept plenty, I'm sure. Okay, so then that would be primary treatment. The junk that we collect will go to a sludge processing. We'll probably directly landfill from here, actually, collect the solids. And then we will also take whatever sludge stuff that we collect here and send that to a sludge processing. We're going to add to that the secondary sedimentation, which happens after we grow a bunch of biologicals, right? We're going to keep a bunch of happy bacteria growing. Sometimes we'll use cyanobacteria, as is the case we saw a few minutes ago, that like lime green wastewater discharge. Essentially, that's going to be some algae and or cyanobacteria. So there's a technical difference there. Cyanobacteria, algae being perhaps a generic term, but specifically usually used to describe eukaryotic algae cells, cyanobacteria referring to bacteria species that are capable of photosynthesis. Okay, so sometimes if it's open to sunlight, you might get some cyanobacteria, but typically it'll just be some sort of heterotrophic bacteria that's going to munch on anything it can, and we're going to feed it as much oxygen as we can, and that's going to keep it very well mixed in that chamber, or at least within the column. Sometimes we might arrange them so they are slightly plug flow like, but with all this bubbling, it's inevitable that they're going to be quite well mixed generally. From there, we're going to, after we've grown all these bacterial cells, then we're going to try to get rid of them with sedimentation. Okay, and as we'll look at next time, we often are going to assume that we can do that perfectly well and preserve basically all of the bacteria so that we can recycle some of them to make sure we have plenty of bacteria in our system. So we need this bacterial recycle, because if the wastewater itself that's coming in doesn't have enough bacteria, which typically it won't, then if we just get rid of all the bacteria we just produced, we're starting with a very low concentration of bacteria, and we don't have enough to do as much eating as is possible. Okay, so we will often recycle the bacteria, or rather a portion of them, and then send the rest into sludge processing. Sometimes what we will do with that sludge processing is create biosolids, which, if you think about it, we've just given bacteria as much time as they could possibly want to eat a bunch of junk. And then we've collected those bacteria. And so then it's going to be a little bit like soil in a sense. Soil particles, it's a mixture of stuff, but a lot of it is actually bacteria, or there's a whole lot of bacteria there. So this will be some sediment-like sludge, and if we dry it out enough, it'll probably have some consistency a little bit like fine soil particles or something. And so we can then use that, apply it as biosolids if we process it sufficiently, which we'll talk about, I think, in a week or two. Essentially getting it free of pathogens, or not free of pathogens, but we've made sure that other organisms are outcompeting the pathogens for existence in this, and that it has achieved some level of heat, that it's very unlikely that typical pathogens will be able to survive it or thrive in any way. So it reduces the pathogen load, it further consumes some of the chemical contaminants we might be worried about, but inevitably it's going to have some heavy metals. It's typical that heavy metals end up in our wastewater systems, and they will collect here. And so when we apply them to land, we have a whole systems to say, okay, you can't apply more than X mass of biosolids ever in a lifetime for this plot of land. And so we have some system where we can use them for a time, but we have checks and calibrations to make sure that we don't ever get it to a point where we are contaminating beyond a reasonable amount. So it's a kind of a nutrient recycle, which is great, but a trade-off there, we have to be careful with accumulating contaminants. Okay, from the secondary then, and really the secondary treatment, by the way, probably would just include these guys. The sludge recycle and processing is a little bit of a separate issue. If we don't process our biosolids, then essentially what we do is dewater them and then ship them off to a landfill. Okay, so that's the other alternative. That's the disposal. Okay, secondary treatment then has the bioreactor, removal of the bacteria, which helps us recycle and keep the bioreactor going properly, and then a disinfectant dosing and discharge. So this disinfectant, if we use something like chlorine, then of course we'd have to remove it back out of the water. We'd have to quench the chlorine before discharging into nature, because chlorine is not good for fish and wildlife. Okay, so that's kind of the big picture of wastewater treatment. There are anaerobic systems. Sometimes we might combine a bioreactor like this that's shown with the bubbles with a bioreactor, maybe sequence it, and there's various reasons to do so, to specifically target some of the nutrients at play or some of the contaminants. And so maybe we would add something like that, rather than take the disinfectant here, we would add another bioreactor or two, and we'd probably call that tertiary treatment if it were specifically targeting then to get like phosphate removal or nitrogen removal kind of stuff. But in essence, this would be a typical run-of-the-mill wastewater treatment plant that is, these are kind of the essential components. So it is kind of interesting in a way. We make use of all these microbes, and then we have to get rid of all the microbes, right? So that's sort of the essence of it. Okay, regarding regulations and standards, I'm going to talk primarily with regards to surface water discharges. As I said earlier, there's a whole set of regulations for groundwater discharges, because it is possible to inject wastewater into the groundwater or into the ground, and there are regulatory issues or standards there as well. They're going to be fairly similar, and they're going to have the same types of considerations in mind. You have the added potential complication of, if you think about like a septic system, which maybe I'll add a little bit about like point of use wastewater treatment. That thought literally just occurred to me that might be a fun thing to cover, and I could develop I'd lecture for that instead of maybe biosolids or something. But anyway, if you think about it, a standard septic system, your biggest potential problem is clogging the pipes that leach out into a field, because the septic system will have an anaerobic bioreactor, then it acts as a sedimentation tank too, and it slowly discharges into a field, and it kind of waters your grass, and that seeps into the groundwater, and ideally you don't get human exposure to that, and that filtration through the soil prevents too much travel of pathogens. In that type of a system, if you end up discharging a lot of particulate matter that ends up floating through the septic system and making its way into those pipes, you could clog them. You could think of the same issue might apply to a groundwater discharge. You don't want to clog up the soil too bad. So I assume that a groundwater discharge has some higher need of particulate matter control. Okay, that aside, we're going to talk about surface water discharges. And really, if we're talking about water quality standards, we have a couple different types of standards. Water quality being the primary or the most common. Sometimes we'll say we have a technological standard. You have to use this type of technology because your industry tends to produce this type of contaminant, and this is the best technology on hand. If you do it right, then we know that you're going to have the best treatment we can afford, right? That's reasonable. So sometimes we'll have a technological standard, but primarily we do it based on water quality standards, which are developed based on the receiving water. So discharging into a very, very clean, quiet, slow-flowing, like small flow rate stream is much different than discharging into the Mississippi River, because the two different waters have different assimilation capacities. For one, like how much of an impact are you having on the actual chemistry there, and that amount of impact, you would want to look at what kind of wildlife and things are there. So there's going to be some sort of ecological assessment for large discharges. EPA delegates this regulatory authority to state entities. Typically, can also do tribal entities, but I don't think any have developed their own. Developed that. There are a few states that haven't bothered to do this yet, so it's the EPA directly regulates. For the most part, most states will develop their own DEQ or something like that, and then they will have, let's say, the Louisiana DEQ, the Michigan DEQ, and they have an EPA authorized NPDES system in place. And so I was a permit writer briefly for that in Michigan. The NPDES system here, some people might call it NPDES as just a way to say the acronym. So you'll hear that out in the field. Essentially, it was originally created, and the intent was to, initially it was to completely eliminate, as we'll see, but to reduce or eliminate discharges of pollutants to surface waters is kind of the directive there. And what it should essentially always do is protect the intended uses of a receiving water. So intended uses meaning anything that people might want to use it for. Okay, so this would be recreation, fishing, boating, swimming, drinking water source, we would include, and you could maybe call this a subset of recreation, but you would include also the capacity to maintain to continue being a habitat for wildlife, right? So wildlife habitat. And really, actually, the first sources of wastewater treatment that we ever really had in terms of regulation were sourced for the purposes of navigation, actually. which makes some sense, right? When, early on, there wasn't as large of a human impact, the smaller human population. What was the priority was transportation, right? That was a big deal. That was really important for people's livelihoods. Say 1900, something like that. So the other thing this system will do is actually protect industries in a sense. So if an industry wants to make use of water, create and generate wastewater as part of their operation, let's say they're a clothing manufacturer, they're dealing with a lot of dyes to dye fabrics. Well, chances are very good they're going to have some sort of a processed water that they have to use in order to rinse off the excess dye from the clothes or something like that, right? So they're going to ultimately end up with some sort of a wastewater. And if they were to have no pollutant discharge system here in place, no way of having a permit to discharge wastewater, then essentially they're liable for any damage they might cause. That somebody could say, you've harmed me because of your discharge, right? And so then the burden of proof would be on that industry to say, well, no, actually we cleaned our wastewater to this extent, and therefore it should not have harmed you. In fact, we've gone and studied the river to prove that it's not harming anybody. And what kind of clothing manufacturer has the money to do all that research? Right? They're not going to be investing in that. If that would not be a viable industry. They're going to say, well, it's too expensive to make you clothes. I'm just not going to make you clothes, right? No socks for you or whatever. So at the end of the day, what a permit then does is puts that burden on the EPA essentially to formulate standards that are reasonable, and they take the burden, the litigation burden. So if they're not holding the clothing industry to the correct standards, then we sue the EPA to do their job or to revise their standards to make sure that it's actually protective. So it's kind of a strange system in that regard. We actually see a great benefit for industries, even if a given industry or operator might be thinking to themselves, oh, this is so burdensome. The bigger picture, it's actually quite protective, assuming they're following their permit, right? That's the thing. Like a permit, the wastewater permits here are a lot like a driver's license, right? If you drive properly and follow the intended regulations and rules, then there's not really a big issue, right? You pay a fee to get it. You have to pass the tests and all that. In terms of wastewater, you're going to be providing monitoring evidence and things like that. And the state has the authority to come in and inspect all that. And then you're protected, assuming you are complying, right? And so then that industry can't be sued by the average Joe who thinks that the discharge harmed them. They could sue the EPA for that potentially, but not the industry directly. So it's protective in that sense. Okay, so a bit more about kind of the typical pollutants we're talking about and how they impact our receiving waters, right? So the first I mentioned earlier is biological oxygen demand. In this little picture here is, by the way, another activated sludge system, and that would be kind of your typical heterotrophic bacteria. It's typically this soil brown color, and actually, if you've got a wastewater treatment plant operating well, and you've got plenty of air, you don't have anaerobic processes when you wanted to have aerobic, it actually shouldn't smell too bad, technically. It should smell a little musty, maybe a little bit like dirt or kind of forest decay matter, not too unpleasant. It's really when you get anaerobic processes that becomes more unpleasant. So biological oxygen demand, we measure in terms of the milligrams of oxygen that can be consumed per liter. So in water, our dissolved oxygen saturation is often something like 8 to 10 milligrams per liter. Just as a little standard here. It is very temperature dependent. So if you have cold water, maybe you get up to 15 to 20 milligrams per liter. Some other solutes can affect it a little bit. I think chloride has some impact. But generally, at least 5 milligrams per liter, if it was very hot or something, should be able to dissolve and be in solution. So when we think about the milligrams per liter that this biological oxygen demanding stuff, because really what we're talking about is oxygen demanding substances. And this is then a kind of a catch-all term for anything that bacteria can consume, and in doing so, for an energy source, essentially, to perform respiration, breathing in and out for these bacteria. So that amount of oxygen demanded is what we're measuring specifically, and it is capturing a catch-all for bacterial food in that regard. Okay, so that's our term. That's what we're going to use, and it becomes very handy to use it framed in that manner when we look at discharges into, let's say, a stream or river, and we want to know how quickly is oxygen getting back into the river based on the stream dynamics, based on the temperature, all that. That's going to be quite handy. Okay, so that's I guess the first conventional pollutant. The next one would be total suspended solids. Pretty obvious, right? There's just particulate matter that's suspended in solution. If we have a lot of it, that could clog things up or just cause the water to be turbid, right? So if you have a very, very clear stream and then you add a whole bunch of particles into it, even if it's clean water just with a lot of particles, you're going to then have some big impact there in terms of visibility in it, and so on. So that's TSS, milligrams per liter. Usually that also corresponds to some other impacts. It's usually not just particle matter, right? Yeah, pH, of course, that's going to be important for a lot of reasons. If you happen to have some industry that's discharging a wastewater that happens to be really acidic, that could be a problem, so maybe you have to neutralize something or deal with that. Fecal coliforms, again, that's a generic catch-all type term for bacteria that tend to be associated with warm gut environments. Sometimes these are naturally occurring in the environment, especially in places like Louisiana, where we have pretty warm areas, a lot of marsh and swamplands that could be sort of similar to a gut environment in terms of it's very warm and have plenty of water around. So sometimes these will be naturally occurring, but usually they're like the idea is we want to measure for bacteria that indicate there's some fecal contamination, right? So we'll measure for that. And then there's oil and grease, which kind of might sound funny at first because almost out of left field, but that's really there as one of our conventional pollutants because rivers were catching on fire. And that's not a good thing. And if you discharge a whole bunch of oil and grease, well, a standard treatment plant might take care of some of it, or perhaps you could get some of it at least with a biological process. But if you think about it, your primary treatment, so if we were to go all the way back up to look at our primary treatment here, if this is perhaps what was the first wastewater treatment systems may have just had primary treatment, well, the screen and grit chamber, they're not going to remove the oil and grease because that's, it's liquid. The sedimentation is certainly not, it's going to be floating. And so then you just discharge a bunch of oil and grease, even if you've cleaned up the wastewater a little bit. So that's an important component. If you have there are such things as grease traps for industries that are producing a lot of oils and greases that can have a particular design to remove them physically. But generally, our modern wastewater systems should take care of a lot of that. Okay, so I mentioned, here's the oil and grease example. This is the Cuyahoga River, I think in the 1950s. we've got a little article on this. This is posted to Moodle, by the way. I'll show you. So a neat little article here. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so I'm just going to show you here. Okay, on the top, it's the Cuyahoga River today. On the left here, that was 1952 fire, and I think I used this. Maybe it was a bigger image of it, but how do you fight that fire, right? You're gonna spray water on your grease fire, and where are you getting the water? Are you getting it from this river? Are you spraying grease on the grease fire? Is that what you're doing? A mixture of grease and water. So that's quite a disaster. And then if you think about, okay, well, maybe we just need to let it burn out, but what about this bridge over here? Or what about, the wind's starting to blow that way. Uh-oh. So quite a scary thing to think about. Okay, so then Cleveland reporter lifts his hand out of the river's thick, oily soup in the Cleveland River. So you can see just his hand just coated in that grease there. Okay, so the article goes on. We'll read a bit in the slides from that. But okay, did I already show you this one? I think I did, right? Not seen this? Okay, so this was an example. Maybe I just did from that class. Sorry, I forget. Okay, so a more modern example. So we have just a picture of it. So this was 2015.